In the name of the God of surprises, amen. This time of the year, if we think about Luke at all, and we might not, we're probably thinking about the gospel he wrote, which is the source of most of what we think of as a Christmas story, including the lead up to it that we just heard. But Luke also wrote a volume 2. We call it the Acts of the Apostles, and it's full of stories of how the movement Jesus began spread throughout the Roman Empire, thanks especially to the work of missionaries like Paul. Luke tells us that when Paul and his colleague Silas got to Thessalonica in Greece, some people welcomed what they had to say, but other people got so upset they formed a mob and went looking for Paul and Silas, and when they couldn't find them, they grabbed their host and some of the other followers of Jesus and dragged them to court for treating Paul and Silas as guests. And what was it that so upset the crowd about Paul and Silas? These people have been turning the world upside down. These people, these followers of Jesus who are claiming that he and not Caesar is the king, have been turning the world upside down. Well, no wonder. In the piece of his gospel we just heard, Luke describes the encounter when Mary, this young woman with no idea that her life was going to be anything special, discovers she's pregnant, but not just with any child. The way Luke tells the story, Mary knows from the beginning, long before Jesus is born, that her son has a unique destiny. Luke doesn't tell us why God chose this particular young Jewish girl for a calling that's really unique in human history. But all through the Bible, there are stories of God calling people to do remarkable things. Abraham and Sarah were called to leave everything they knew and set off for a land that they'd never seen because God had promised it to them, and in the process giving birth to the people of Israel. Moses, raised in the household of Pharaoh, but inspired to lead that same people of Israel out of slavery. The prophets, who found themselves compelled to speak in God's name, whether anybody wanted to hear what they had to say or not. David, a shepherd boy, who's chosen to be Israel's king. Because God seems to have a preference for choosing the people we would never have thought of to do what needs to be done. And so it's a country girl who should have been terrified by what's happening to her, but instead accepts what she hears, and she says what people who accept God's call always have to say. Here I am, the Lord's servant. Let it be to me as you will. As Luke tells it, Mary does what anybody who's just had an experience like hers would do. She goes off to find somebody to tell what has happened. In this case, it's her cousin Elizabeth. But because Luke imagines the whole episode as charged with supernatural insight, Elizabeth already knows that Mary is special because the child that she'll bring into the world is special. And Mary responds by telling Elizabeth and us how she's making sense of what's happening to her. And she does that by anticipating what her son's birth will mean. but not as something she hopes will happen, not as something that will surely happen, but in her mind, something that has already happened. God has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. God has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. Think about it. Her baby has not even been born yet, but in the mind of that young Jewish girl from Nazareth, it's already happened. God has turned the world upside down. And Mary knew about what a world was like when there's a huge gap, an uncrossable gap, between the powerful on their thrones and the lowly who are a long way down. She knew about what the world is like when some people are feasting and others are begging at their door, because that was the world she lived in. A country girl from Galilee would have known more than she wished about power, because her people lived under occupation, and the Romans knew a lot about making sure they kept things the way they were. And she would have known more than she wished about hunger, because in her world there were hungry people everywhere. But Mary also belonged to a people who'd always known that if that's the way the world was, it wasn't the way God meant for it to be. They remembered how God had led them out of their slavery. Week by week, they listened to the prophets who kept the dream alive, God's dream of a world where power is used for everybody's good and not for the private greed of just a few. God's dream of a world where there is no more hunger, where the world is like one big banquet that just goes on and on. And like all the Jewish people who listened to those prophets who shared God's dream, they clung to the promise because it was the only hope they had. But they must have asked themselves, how long? And Mary is sure she knows the answer. God has already done it. In sending Jesus to be born into that world that she knew all too well, God had already turned the world upside down. And sure enough, the time would come when her son would grow up, and when he's baptized, he learns what Mary had already sung about. He is God's beloved Son, and he's ready now to do what God has called him to do. And he goes home, and he goes to the synagogue where he'd worshiped and where he'd studied and where he'd heard those prophets. And he reads from Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." And why? To bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then he adds the words that must surely have warmed his mother's heart. Today, in your hearing, these words have come true. In Jesus, God is turning the world upside down. In Jesus, God has turned the world upside down. That dream of God has begun to come true. People are learning the value of forgiving each other. People are learning the joy of sharing. People are discovering that those they thought were others turn out to be more like them than they thought. People are actually trying to figure out what has to happen so that people stop killing each other. What has to happen so that nobody is hungry. What has to happen so that nobody has to sleep outside in the snow. Nobody has to be terrified of a knock on the door. Nobody has to wonder if life is worth living. Nobody has to wonder if they matter to God. Nobody has to wonder if justice can be real. Nobody has to ask if they're welcome at God's table or at ours. Luke tells us that when Mary and Joseph took their firstborn Jesus to the temple to be presented to God as their Jewish tradition demanded, an old man saw them and warned Mary that a sword would pierce her own soul. Because turning the world upside down has its price. In Jesus' case, the cross. And yet the book of Acts tells us that it happened because wherever they went, those Christians were upsetting the status quo by offering an alternative way of seeing, of understanding, of living. And they found out, as Jesus found out, that helping God's dream come true isn't necessarily popular with everybody. They found out, in the phrase of a 20th century prophet named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the cost of discipleship. Living by God's values, living by God's dream, does turn the world upside down. Mary looked into the future and she saw that her son was going to do just that. And although she didn't always understand what he was up to, she stayed with him to the end. She saw the world turned upside down over and over. She saw broken people healed. She saw people who had always been ignored come close so her son could talk to them. She saw Jesus stand up to the powerful of the world, the Herods, the Pilates, without thinking about the consequences. She saw Jesus call out the greed and the selfishness and the callousness that ignored the ones who suffered as a result. And when Jesus' own work was over, it just went on, as his followers began turning the world upside down in their own way and in their own time. Mary never turned her back on Jesus. She was an integral part not only of the Christmas story, but of the whole of Jesus' story. This morning we've added Martha Thornley, one of Christ Church's own, to our Jesse tree. As Mary was an integral part of Jesus' story turning the world upside down, so was she. Organizing a meal program for people with AIDS in the early, scary days of the epidemic. Working for many years with the Kairos program and its ministry with women in prison. And helping to begin Christ Church's shelter for unhoused people. And so we remember her today with thanksgiving, along with a 2,000-year-old tradition of women who inspire us as they have followed Mary in helping her son make things different, make things new. You know, the Christmas story can so easily be softened, romanticized. But let's not forget what Mary thought was the true meaning of Christmas. In this birth that we're about to celebrate, God turned the world upside down, and God is still doing it. And maybe that's what we should be doing too. Amen.